Well, hello and a very warm welcome to this last in my series on cinema and the American avant-garde. If you're just joining this, there is a whole raft of lectures on this topic so far. I've gathered them all together in a playlist, so it should be easy for you to watch them sequentially if you would like to do that. What's going to happen in this video is it's a bit of a different format anyway, so you should be caught up enough to follow what's going on. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story, first of all, about what happened in the final session I gave in delivering this module. I did a bit of an experiment with my students that day before moving into the lecture proper, and the lecture involved doing quite a brief overview of what we'd looked at in the course and trying to tie all the threads together, and that culminated then in looking at slippages, convergences, parallels, all those sorts of things between avant-garde practices and industrial Hollywood practices in filmmaking throughout the 20th century in North America in a very reduced way, of course. That's the nature of teaching on 12-week courses. If you're diligent and you've realised that there are 11 of these, it's because week 8 was a reading week. So I think back at the start, if you've been paying attention, I said there would be 12, but there's actually 11 because there was a week where there was no class. This will culminate in looking at David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, and so hopefully that'll make sense by the time I get through all the rest of everything before we get there. But what I want to do, first of all, is I want to explain, as I say, what happened that day, because I had a bit of a weird idea. Just to set the scene for you, it was my first ever full-time teaching post, but it was fixed term. I only had the job for 5 months. I was just providing cover and then I was out on my ear again. So by the end of this, I had nothing left to lose, really. In part because I had another job lined up in the autumn, and I had a summer of moving back to Belfast from Aberdeen and not really having very much money and that sort of stuff. And I was 28 years old and, I just wanted to do something a bit interesting. So one of my research interests is in performance art. And so I just wanted to do something that was more practice-led, I suppose, teaching that was practice-led. Now, we'd mentioned Yoko Ono quite a bit in the module because she was part of the Fluxus group, and a lot of her film work was really pretty radical in terms of paving the way for what would be identified by scholars a bit later on as structural film. Okay, and I think it's back in the 4th video where we looked at that in a bit of detail. So I think she's a hugely important figure in all of this. What I did was I set my students a bit of a task, and I didn't explain anything to them. What I did was I put together this slide set and I had it running behind me on a screen, and they just had to figure out what to do. So the idea of Yoko Ono's cut piece was that she invited audience members to come up and cut her clothing, and what they did was up to them. A lot of the exercise was to demonstrate how vulnerable the artist can be and to put into question what are art materials, what is it to be an active spectator, an active participant, to break that boundary of being a passive audience and actually take part in the work of art, because she just sat there and they were told what to do, they were given the tools, they had the tools at their disposal, and what they did was up to them. And she was in a really vulnerable position because if you can see the image on screen, they were using pretty big, sharp shears, no safety scissors in sight. Yoko Ono first performed cut piece in 1965, and there are excerpts from this on YouTube. It's the sort of work that can be reperformed, and it's a completely different piece every time it is performed and enacted. As I've said in this slide here, it's an exercise in experience and encounter. It involves a degree of trust, because the sorts of shears that people were using, they can easily become weapons, very dangerous ones at that, or there could be an accident that happened, so a bit of a health and safety nightmare. May not be something you could get away with doing these days, but in 1965 this was quite a radical thing to do. What I had done was I had left this slide set running behind me, and I was sitting very much as Ono was in these images. I just sat on the floor very quietly, very still, and I had the slide set running behind me. I was wearing quite old clothes. I was wearing layers of quite old clothes. My students later, when we discussed it, asked how far I was prepared to go, and I told them there wasn't one piece of clothing on my body that I was not prepared to lose that day, and I had a full change of clothes with me, and so it was about how far they were prepared to go. So it was a really fascinating experiment, and it was one of my students, someone who I'm still in touch with and became quite a dear friend. This person clocked what was happening, understood it, and was the first to make a cut. It was quite a long time before any of them would cross that boundary, and I was extremely grateful for that student for doing that. And I remember fondly, this was the same student who did a presentation about Portrait of Jason, did extremely well, and he's just a fantastic human being. So I'm very grateful to Daniel Simpson for that. So Daniel really led the way with the students and coaxed a lot of the others into participating. And it was really interesting because, again, I was in that very vulnerable position, and also I'm not a performer and I'm very much an introvert, so I was sitting there trying not to laugh and trying not to feel silly a lot of the time. I had taken my glasses off, so I couldn't see anything very well, and I didn't close my eyes tight shut, but I kept them just low so that I could see a bit of the floor and I could discern shadows and that sort of thing. So I could see movement, and I couldn't tell who was cutting me. I knew Daniel was first because he spoke a little bit, and I don't know, I felt his presence. There were a few students who I had got to know quite well, and I just knew it was them, strangely. But a lot of the time I didn't know who it was, and it was very interesting that at times somebody was quite rough, at times somebody was incredibly gentle. There were some people who I felt very cared for. They were very affectionate when they were doing it. They were very careful. Some people were quite rough, and they would rip the shirt that I was wearing. That had been my favourite shirt. I wore it till it was, and I was quite prepared to lose it because it was ripped to shreds. I'd been just wearing it the whole time I was doing my PhD, and it was a really comfortable shirt and I loved it. So it was quite a fitting end to that shirt, really. And some of the students told me they kept the shards of the shirt that they took, and I think that it was only the shirt that they cut. They left it at that. They took the whole of the shirt and they didn't touch anything else that I was wearing. So I said earlier 1965, so I've got on my slide here that cut piece was first performed by Yoko Ono in 1964, and she has repeated it in Kyoto, Tokyo, New York and London, and as far as I've been aware, she last performed it in Paris in 2003. Slide 8 depicts a much older Ono, and probably that 2003 performance in France. This was something that in a way I felt permitted to do because quite a lot of other artists have appropriated and reappropriated cut piece, and very often the performer doesn't have to be a woman necessarily, but I think that is part of the point of it, that it is a woman because of that vulnerability. Women's bodies in art are very often sexualized, or they have that dichotomy between the Virgin Mother and the whore. It's either sexualized or it's very mumsy, and this does something different with it, and it's the body in a more visceral form. I mean, I've never been an audience member during this. I've been that person having their clothes cut off, and in a way it feels like shedding, and maybe there's a sense of renewal. I think it can be interpreted in many different ways. Whereas my students, I mean, in a way it really crossed the boundary in that if you think about staff-student interactions, there's no rule about something that's basically a piece of performance art that is didactic, that's trying to teach them something that is appropriate to the module that we're doing, but the physical contact that it involved and the potential for where it could have gone concerning my body body as a side of an artwork, but also as the body that I occupy, the personage that I occupy. How appropriate is that? Well, so it posed a lot of questions there, but it was a really interesting teaching and learning exercise. I had the images of the cutting on different performances interspersed with these little snippets of text, because I didn't know, and I provided quite a lot of slides. There's 28 slides here. I think actually it's all repeated. I think there's 14 slides, and then I repeated the whole thing and had it all playing on a loop. So every slide was on for several minutes at a time, because I didn't know how long it was going to last for. I've pointed out here there are many readings of cut piece. As I say, fundamentally the artist's body becomes the art object. It's a site of encounter, and the spectator has to become an active participant. They can't just sit and watch anymore. The artwork doesn't happen unless they participate. They both become the artwork. So there are all these people in the photograph. These are the documentation of the artwork that could in turn be considered artworks in themselves, but their actions, their performances become part of the performance art piece. It's a collaboration, it's contingent. No one knows what anybody else is going to do. No one knows how anybody else is going to approach it. And as I've said here, an exchange of roles takes place. The artist doesn't control it. The artist has facilitated all of the elements of the work being together, but they do not actively participate other than being the body in the room. The audience has to become a collective body of artists. They collectively collaborate and create the artwork. But again, nobody really has any say over how it's going to turn out, or what all it's going to do, what all it's going to look like, and how far it's going to go. And so my final slide was that message to my students. It was quite blunt, really. I wish I knew where I'd got this, and I'm very sorry to whoever put this little comic strip together. If you ever find this, get in touch and I will happily give you credit, because this is gorgeous, where you got this artist's impression of cut piece and Ono's clothes being cut away. It's really up to those active participants, those former passive viewers who have become active participants. It's up to them when it ends and how far it goes. Do they take everything? What do they do? They have to decide the parameters of what modesty is, or how vulnerable to make the person, all of those sorts of things. That was where we started. It was really interesting, and then we had quite an open discussion about it. I wish I could remember it better, but yes, it was quite the experiment. I think quite a lot of the students were quite freaked out. I don't think I could do something like that anymore, because I feel like I don't know, at the risk of ruffling some feathers, I think undergraduate students feel younger or perhaps less mature. These students were very able for this. A lot of them, some of them weren't, but most of them were. Most of them embraced it after having to get over that embarrassment, that hurdle, and then it became, this is what we're doing and this is teaching us something, and they understood that. It made it actually quite a human, intimate experience, and I think it made them realise as well, which I think is incredibly important, is that the people who are teaching you are people as well. They are human, they are vulnerable. You as students actually have a tremendous amount of control over us, which tips the balance of power. I mean, I think there's a whole discussion to have there, and I hope that can help you think that through, and whatever side of that barrier you might be on, but I hope that can help with discussions about that sort of thing, but it's not really the scope of what we're doing here. So this was really just that live element, because something that had come up a lot in the module was active spectatorship. Okay, these are not films, these are not works of art that allow you to be passive the way industrial movies do. They expect passivity and they provide the conditions for that in their screening environment. So the dark desensitized space of the cinema, where it's soundproofed and you've got surround sound and you're immersed in experience, and you're supposed to sit there and either shut up or eat your popcorn. You're just supposed to exist and be enveloped by the screen and the sound system for a couple of hours. This is absolutely not that. A quick overview of cinema and the American avant-garde. Okay, this module that I ran I'll begin by just recalling some of the module's aims. This set of lectures intended to introduce you to histories and theories of American avant-garde cinema. It aimed to analyse and challenge these histories and theories across a range of films and practices. It aimed to consider the development of a new media and what does that mean, and aesthetic experimentation throughout the 20th century and its impact on contemporary filmmaking. Because as you'll see when we get to the end of this, things start to blur quite a bit. I mean, they always did, but I think it becomes just that bit more blurred, that those switches begin, the meshing of different practices becomes a bit more mainstream as we move into the 21st century. And finally, the last aim was to interrogate the marginalisation of histories that do not fit into definitive categories or canons. So what I've tried to do is enhance critical understanding of modernist, very broadly modernist, film and art practices in terms of their more abstract and experimental engagements with questions of form, structure, time, desire and memory. We've looked at these with particular reference to post-war avant-garde visual culture in North America, where film and video artists produced seminal works in this field. We've looked at various theoretical positions, including the artist's own, and we've tried to examine and sometimes question the relevance of these positions to the analysis of films being studied. So I've tried really to encourage you to think beyond traditional positions and debates in film history and theory, and to explore alternative approaches to thinking about the relationships between image and narrative and the role of the spectator and the audience in making meaning. Essentially, I've been trying to introduce these films and different viewing methods to you as the theory. It is these manners of working, these manners of being, these manners of experiencing that leads to the theory. This is why the theories are created. So where have we been on the course? We began with abstraction in the 1930s with Mary Ellen Butte's various methods of visualizing music and sound, and she's one of the several practitioners we've studied with stronger links to European styles and whose interest lies in technological experimentation to attain a purely aesthetic spectatorial experience, and that is that more passive kind of viewing. But it's also a viewing experience that I hope would be full of wonder at the incredible images Butte and her teams created. We also considered the broader history of modernist filmmaking and art practices for that contextual background, for why experimental modes are relevant socially and historically. Then we shifted to the avant-garde canon proper by examining a major player in the American avant-garde's fruition, Maya Deren. P. Adams Sidney, who first identified and compiled this broad canon of the American avant-garde, cites its genesis as beginning with Deren's 1940s psychodramas. And here we looked at the discrepancy between her aversion to psychoanalysis versus the surrealistic content of her earlier films that many would argue beg to be psychoanalyzed. We thought about the different theoretical positions here too, with Deren's own writings, including on documentary and a creative use of reality. Plus I presented a Deleuzian reading as an example of how my students at that time in that place could apply their prior theoretical learning to these works, because they were doing a course that was very heavy in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. We then moved to a contemporary of Deren's, another filmmaker established in the canon, Stan Brakhage, and his more poetic form of self-expression through amateur documentary filmmaking and his relationship with other art forms, including his opposite motion to others in reverting back to abstract expressionism later in his career after mediating the lives of his family in a lot of his earlier work. We left the canon aside for a couple of weeks to look at very different uses of the camera and approaches to what film could be. With the Fluxus group, we discussed the stirrings of later developments in structural filmmaking and their broader activities in interventional performance art and intersections between everyday life, art and technology. We drew a parallel, though, between their methods and more conventional industrial modes of film production. While the group is in flux and concerned with conceptual art practices, George McMahon was also the ringleader, the writer of the manifesto, and a bit like a producer of the Flux film anthology compiled throughout the 1960s. From there, we moved to another kind of orchestrator of mass-produced work, although with a firm production line feel. Andy Warhol's experiments with film and brand new video technology were integral to how filmmaking in general changed in the latter half of the 20th century. His live looped multi-screen recordings contributed to the birth of video art and expanded cinema, while countless filmmakers in New Hollywood and across Europe, particularly those associated with the French Nouvelle Vague, were indebted to his voyeuristic yet wandering camera. He, along with Kenneth Anger, who followed on the course, were also a key starting point in what would become the queer cinema of the 1990s. With Anger, we return to psychodrama, and although in the canon he is aligned with Devlin and Brakhage, I chose to disrupt this in teaching it and put him between two filmmakers for whom sexuality is also a prominent issue. Presented in a different way, similarly to Warhol, Anger also incorporates pop culture iconography, at once embracing and criticising subcultures whose members' activities border on fascist tendencies. Our last topic before what was the Easter break at the time saw a culmination of this loose trio of filmmakers dealing not only with gender and sexuality in their film's contents, but also experimentation with different modes of documentary and documentation. Shirley Clarke was a key figure in the new independent American cinema, but was largely excluded from this area of film history until a resurgence of interest in her work after recent restoration and widespread distribution and promotion, largely through social media when that emerged. She was important in paving the way for younger women filmmakers coming after her and finding a voice and a means of expression for pressing ongoing issues of equality. Clarke's allegorical approach to this is to raise this problem through Aaron Payne's gay black hustler persona of Jason Holliday. We came back to a different tone in spending 2 weeks considering structural film. While the filmmaker's personal interests remain, they are much more subtle, with the devices of filmmaking taking leading roles in the films. With Hollis Frampton, we looked at the tensions he creates between still and moving images, the simultaneous preservation and destruction of photographs, and the ways in which he plays with memory, time, duration and language. When considering Michael Snow, our attention turned to the various challenges he poses to the apparatus of filmmaking and how he uses the camera to urge the viewer to think about vision and perception. I also in the videos encourage you to think about the audio-visual spectatorial experience of being with these kinds of works. We spent time trying to reassess the canon here too. Drummond, Sidney and so on have a firm idea of structural film, but we saw challenges to what structural film is, and should it even be called that, from Bruce Jenkins. While bold, his alternative model might not be as useful or at least as accessible and easily applicable as P. Adams Sidney's. So I think this needs further investigation if that's something you feel interested in. Finally, we considered Bill Viola's video art, a topic that encompasses many of the themes and issues encountered throughout the module: self-expression, discovery, knowledge, duration, the passage of time, ways of watching, the capabilities of filmmaking apparatus, poeticism and the interconnectivity between all things, the micro and macro, life art technology, non-cinematic sites of reception, alternative ways of thinking about narrative, subjective views or distortions of reality as we know it, questions challenging conventional notions of interiority and exteriority, medium specificity, and narratives of the self. Throughout, perhaps without realising, we've engaged in dialogue on the very meaning of cinema. Now we might ask, what is the present and the future of the avant-garde and thinking about the historical avant-garde? We can perhaps appropriately define the term in its historical contexts, but what about now? Where is it now? Are we in a time of the post-avant-garde? And a key consideration here is how the avant-garde has changed with technology. Who is producing experimental work now, well into the 21st century? And in what ways? What are the implications of the digital and the internet? I mean, even when I delivered this course in 2013, we've had an explosion of social media. There are social media that exist today that were not a notion in 2013. Things like TikTok have really changed the game here, and we didn't see that coming in 2013. So what about new platforms like that on which to make, show and distribute work? And sometimes all of these three things are happening all at the same time. A way to address this might be to look back in a different way. One new approach, I think, is Akira Lippitt's recent book, Cinema, which was published in 2012, so it was really very new when I was looking at it on this course. We previously discussed how we might define avant-garde and wondered if experimental as a term was more appropriate, even if it's broader. Lippitt takes this further by offering a redefinition of these kinds of terms, inherently deriving from cinema and what itself derives from photography. Lippitt introduces the concept of X, meaning from or outside or no longer, to a re-evaluation of cinema itself in totality. My way of jumping into this discussion is through examining an intersection between what might be regarded as the inside, that is Hollywood, and the outside, the avant-garde, in Lynch's Mulholland Drive from 2001. A thread underscoring the module has been the relationship between Hollywood and mainstream production systems and underground indie practices, whether due to the artist's geographical locations, their modes of working, or references to or criticisms of Hollywood's devices, processes, its icons, and so on. Mulholland Drive sees a visceral clash of all of these practices and devices. So how to frame this for our purposes on this module? Mulholland Drive culminates all issues raised throughout the avant-garde module. What is the future of avant-garde as a term? Is it hybridization? Is that how it survives? What even is Hollywood now? Well, it's a dream factory where unreality becomes real. It can be surreal and hyper-real. So while reassessing the term avant-garde, why not also reassess the notion of realism? So there's real scope here to get into deep philosophy with this. Devlin, Brackage, Fluxus, Warhol, Anger, Clark, Frampton, Snow, Viola. These are examples from the course. They are just some of the names behind all of this work. The work attached to all of these names shows us different ways of augmenting and viewing the real, maybe even interacting with it, and often in their own distinctive ways, or the ways allowed or allotted by the technologies and techniques they put to use, or they created or managed to get their hands on, whatever. Lippitt lists many types of realism, many realisms: hyper, super, extra, sharp focus, new, painting, photo, sur, realist revival, realism now, post-pop, cool, radical realism, modified, enhanced. There are a multitude of ways of encountering or trying to pin down what we think of as realism. The fusing of the real and its reference can equate hyper-reality with complex temporality. Frampton's photographs exist with every replay of nostalgia in our present and in every replay of them that will ever happen in the future. But the physical objects are gone. They no longer exist. They were destroyed in the making of that film. Their documentation in the film shows them as reference of something indexical. They had been, but no longer are. Yet they are in a different way with every replay of the film. It is difficult to situate this in time. It becomes a live event with every screening, but it is, of course, from the past. We're seeing the ghost or an echo or a shadow of what had been before. And so then this raises questions around memory and cinematic memory, cinema as memory, and all of those related issues. If we consider Mulholland Drive as an example of cinema memory, we can think about the capability of the medium of film to present reality in a different way as opposed to representing it. It presents a narrative, but not as we know it. Some ways to point out where Hollywood and the concerns of this course meet and/or clash in Mulholland Drive include an initial violent clash between Hollywood glamour and faceless, transgressive youth culture. If we think about Sunset Boulevard, we think about Hollywood's gritty, hidden, problematic histories, its shame. We think of levels of control, its decided fates. There is distortion and disruption of conventional devices. There are typical shot reverse shots in an all-American diner, but these are disrupted. There is a floating unsettled camera showing conversations about vivid dreams. The camera sometimes doesn't pay attention, and we've seen this before if we think about Snow, but it's more tied to the narrative than what we did see with Snow. The cinematography, script, acting and genre, all of that. These basic elements and how they're indebted to Hollywood or derived from Hollywood, they all become distorted somehow. They're all not quite right. They're all off kilter. We can think about old school Hollywood, the classical Hollywood of the earlier 20th century. I suppose that of the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s, where we've got that mixture of blonde and brunette protagonists, the references to the old noir device of good and evil binaries, it's pretty on the nose, the kind doe-eyed blonde with natural makeup, juxtaposed against a seemingly dangerous, troublesome, heavily made up, sexualized brunette. The identities that come with these stereotypes. The mirrors, the fractured self-images, the excitement when this is seen and noticed in the frame. References to Rita Hayworth and Gilda pretending to be someone else, a femme fatale. The distinction between the great actress and the movie star. And these roles are carried by Naomi Watts and Laura Harring, as well as casting Ann Miller as Coco, who was a dancer and the star of low-budget 1940s and 50s Hollywood movies. Hollywood itself, it's a place that is real, but it's also not real. It's where dreams are made. It's a place and it's an idea of a place. Betty, who is played by Naomi Watts, is from Deep River, Ontario. She goes from a real place to a dream place. It's a place where memory loses functionality. Things become different. It's where the dream state and the real become enmeshed, where symbols, colours and icons, the likes of pink paint over jewellery, blue keys, the cowboy, they possess intangible meaning. What do these say or represent about Hollywood? It is a place where the host of a live midnight cabaret insists that it is all a tape, an illusion, a recording, that there is no such thing as a live performance. It is always ever in the past or a document. It is a place of absence and presence, and so many of the largely and notably female cast are there, but they're not quite there. If we turn to the issue of creativity in Hollywood or its death, the death of of creativity as raised by Martha Nochimson. We might recall Maya Deren's views on the creative use of reality and contrast this with what Nochimson identifies as Lynch's criticism of this in the bad acting of Rita, whom we later find out is actually the girl, Camilla Rhodes, whom the character Adam is coerced into casting as the lead role in his film. This also reminds us of the levels of patriarchal power and control operating in Hollywood. While the dark woman with confused identity is dangerous, she remains a pawn in a destructive game of strategy. As Nochimson states, quote, "In Mulholland Drive, creative energy is blocked, and the girl's body is ultimately the sign of the industry's putrefaction. The corpse of Diane Selwyn, a horrible, disfigured, rotted memento mori of pop culture," unquote. It's interesting to note that Mulholland Drive was originally a made-for-TV movie by Lynch, made with largely the same cast, and his original intention was for a series. Lynch's interests for more than a decade now have turned towards the internet's capability to continue narratives, bringing us back to the question of the future of experimental forms of filmmaking and narrativity, as well as that seepage of reality and the dream world. To borrow again from Nochimson, the film shouldn't leave us pondering the fates of its characters, but rather the future of the pop culture generated by the real, non-real space to which they are tethered. This brief presentation on Mulholland Drive, I cut this off quite short because we watched the film together during this session, and I spoke really very rapidly and quick fire because I think this class was on a Thursday and the Friday after was the last day of term, so we had no seminar the following Monday. So I left enough time for us all to have a class discussion and to talk about their final assessments and so on. So it cut off quite abruptly there, but really this is a presentation of ideas. I think there's been quite a lot there to draw together, a lot of thinking and a lot of questions to keep probing about this relationship or this lack of relationship or this tension, these connections or disconnections between industrial, commercial, conventional practices and experimental practices. So things that are on the periphery of the mainstream, but that are also pushing the technologies, pushing the capabilities, pushing the artistry and making new knowledge, making new ideas through what they do with the technologies and what they do with the ideas. That really leaves you there, and I really hope that this gives you something to go off and investigate for yourself if this is an area of interest for you. If you're studying this kind of material in your course or whatever you're doing, I hope this gives you a few other areas to look into, and I hope you've just enjoyed this presentation of some ideas that I've just thrown at you. I can't thank you enough. I'd ask you to, if you've been enjoying these videos, please do subscribe and share with your networks. If you can support my work, I'd hugely appreciate something over at buymeacoffee.com/PEI Blair. If you want to read some of my other work, you can find my blog at peiblair.blogspot.com. Do subscribe because this is not the end. There's going to be more. I've got more modules worth of stuff to come. But that's a wrap for cinema and the American avant-garde. Thank you very much and take care.